Good day. Welcome to one of our Answers Weekly Wraps. I'm Viv Govender, and what we'll do as usual is go through a few stories of the week as well as a little AI segment at the end to cover what I think is one of the more interesting developments in global markets over the last couple of years. So, what are our three stories of the week? Firstly, we're going to look at the US CPI number. Then we're going to look at some energy prices that are coming through, and finally we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into China. We have some Chinese news this week, and I think that it's worth looking at the world's second or first largest economy, depending on how you count these things. In our AI segment, we'll talk about Apple and a couple other things that have come out in the last week or so. Let's start off with the US CPI number. US CPI came in lower than expected for the 12-month period, was down or lower by about 0.1 than had been anticipated. Month on month was about 0.2, which is as expected. 0.2 translates roughly to a 4.5 to 5 yearly number, which obviously is not great, but I mean the 3.2 number that we saw coming through was significantly better than what we saw last year when we were seeing above 8 in terms of the inflation number. And I think that overall the market treated this reasonably positively. We did see global markets rally on the news. Markets, as we all know, want to have lower inflation because it's increased the chances of a rate cut, and rate cuts are going to be very good for stock markets at the current point in time. Now, a couple of things I want to point out here. So this is continuing a trend. This is a little bit of reversal of lower interest rates. However, we are still significantly away from where our targets are, or global targets are. Like the US wants to have interest rates, inflation around about 2%. Interest rates at the moment are significantly, above that, and above even the current, inflation rate. But so there's the real interest rates being, over 2% in the US at the moment. Unfortunately, you need to get from 3.2 down to 2%, and that last little bit may be more difficult than some people anticipate. Why? Because we are seeing some reflection in terms of wage growth, etc., coming through at the moment, which had to be happening. People are not going to sit back and not increase their wages just because of, increase their wages when the unemployment rate is about 3.5%. Look, almost nobody's unemployed, and your wages are not rising as fast as inflation. That doesn't last very long. So we are seeing wage growth come through, and that might be a bit of a reversal. And that brings us to the next topic as well, that we are seeing as a reversal coming through as well in energy prices. Energy prices are rising. We had a huge week this week in terms of natural gas prices, well over double digits increases on certain days in Europe. We also saw, oil prices hit, towards a multi-month high. Oil prices have been drifting lower. Brent crude towards the low 70s, like over a month ago, now closer to the high 80s. So that's a significant reversal. And there's a number of factors for this. Firstly, we are seeing a cutback in terms of production from, for instance, the Saudis and other members of OPEC+. The Saudis have come out and said that they wanted to have oil prices a bit firmer. Who knows exactly what it is, but it's probably around this level or maybe a little higher. Remember, even though the Saudis make a huge amount of money from oil, they've kind of used that money, so they need to have a massive difference between the cost of production and the amount they sell it for in order to balance their budgets. They give away a lot of freebies or whatever. And the same thing is true for most of these oil exporting countries, Nigeria, Russia, etc. They need oil prices to be a bit higher. And speaking of Russia, the tensions are increasing in that particular sphere. We've seen, more bombings in Moscow itself. We've seen attacks on facilities in Russia. At the same time, it appears that the traditional, or the conventional war in the Ukraine is going in the Russians' favor. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. So the Ukrainians are not making much progress on the battlefield, barely budging the Russian lines, and suffering massive casualties and massive loss of equipment as well. And that's also resulted in more and more equipment being sent to them. They're getting the first Abrams tanks, for instance, coming through, which is like a higher level of weaponry. There's talk about fighter jets, which is still on the cards. I think their pilots are being trained at the moment. The West is happy to give them the jets, but maybe not happy to give them their pilots to try to fly them. And exactly flying a rocket, with missiles attached to it is not exactly a simple task. So they obviously have to have training for that. So I think we are seeing a significant amount of developments happening there, but none of them resulting in a reduction in tension. So that's obviously one thing. The next thing is we have seen more tensions between Iran and the West. There's even been talk of placing US soldiers on tankers to prevent the Iranians trying to do something with them. The Iranians have complained about the fact that the US has confiscated some of their tankers. In fact, there's a tanker apparently recently confiscated that's currently in the US that the Americans trying to sell the oil from because they're saying this is breaking sanctions. So yeah, this is quite a increase in tensions. At the same time, hopefully China is recovering, and that's obviously going to be good for the global economy, but obviously it can also increase oil prices as well. Just another that fact here, I've seen a report from Bloomberg that apparently they think by as early as 2027, the amount of fuel used for road travel will be hitting a peak, never to go back to that level again because of electrical vehicles. I think electrical vehicles are great, but I don't know if anyone has looked at who wrote that report for Bloomberg has really looked at the supply chain required to get that many electrical vehicles onto the roads. We just don't have the mining capacity at the moment and the materials available to replace the majority of the current fleet on the road with electrical vehicles. It's just something that's going to take a long time to do. Not years, but over a decade. Okay. And speaking of China, this is going to be a deep dive. Okay, my take on this is as follows. I am very nervous about China. I don't advise investing or over-investing in China at the moment. I'm saying to avoid it entirely, but I want to give you some reasons why I don't like China right now. The first thing is that Xi Jinping, the guy in charge of China, is old. He's established himself as the undisputed ruler, and historically this does not work out for any country. When you have an old undisputed ruler, what happens is firstly they get out of touch. They don't understand what's happening in the world. I mean, I don't know if Xi Jinping basically knows how to basically operate in a modern information age, quite frankly. He's old. He was born basically in the 1950s. He's not a guy that can actually and his early childhood was spent in a very strange way. I mean, they call him a caveman because he spent some years in a cave in Mao's revolution. So he's not grown up with the kind of technology. He's not au fait with it. And unlike in the US, there's a small problem. I don't think Mitch McConnell or Joe Biden or even Nancy Pelosi are quite familiar as they should be with the current information technology and economy that they're dealing with. But they don't really cause or as much trouble as the Chinese Communist Party can cause. I mean, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, they're getting out and they're doing their things. Mark Zuckerberg, these people are operating in an environment in which, yes, the politicians may not know what's happening, but they don't really depend on them knowing what's happening in order to basically innovate and proceed. In China, that's not true. The Chinese government has a much stronger control of their economy, and the Chinese company really needs to have the government understand and approve what it's doing in order to basically make some serious success. Because we've seen numerous cases in the past where the Chinese government has been particularly difficult on Chinese companies in the tech sector. For instance, Alibaba down 67%, etc., from the highs from a couple of years ago. Not all because of a wicked economy, but also because of the fact that their founder Jack Ma said a few sentences that were deemed to be negative by the Chinese Communist Party, and we saw effectively him taken out of action. He's retired now, doesn't appear much in public, and when he does, just says bland things. Compare that to Elon Musk, who's on Twitter, or X as it is now called, going after the current administration, going after politicians, making his opinions pretty well known. The second thing to point out is that the Chinese economy has a serious difficulty. So, firstly, the leadership is not great, and normally that alone would make me think, this is bad to be investing in. Like I said, in an autocratic country with an aging politician. The example is Vladimir Putin. Look what he's done to his country. Look at Robert Mugabe. You can go through history and you can find many examples of this, and it is not good for an economy when you have someone with that much power who's not improving every day or every year or so on. It's probably going to be in the decline for the next couple of decades until he's basically removed or more likely dies in power and then somebody else replaces him. So not good. But the other factors that affected the economy as well. First of all, the Chinese demographic shift is real and it's very, very significant. Well, what I mean by that, China had what's called a one-child policy. This means that they basically prohibited people in certain areas of the country from having more than one child. This was to control population, etc. in the 1970s, 80s, even the 60s, so there was a period where people were worried about overpopulation to a large extent. They thought, there'll be too many people out there in the world, not enough resources, we'll be starving, blah, blah, blah. Literally, people thought we'd be starving right now. Not understanding a couple of things. First of all, human ingenuity is quite great, and we've done more with less, because of that ingenuity, we're more efficient. So the resource, restraint is not as strong. The next thing is that people have stopped having children at the same rate that they were in the past. It comes down to the fact that, if given a choice, most young women don't want to have kids when they're 21 or 22. They want to probably start having kids when they're 30 something. That is generally when you find, the desire to be the greatest, if given the option. And this gets worse when you have more, in terms of alternatives, in terms of how to live a lifestyle. When you can go basically as a young woman in the West and, take care of yourself, have sufficient opportunities to travel, to advance your career and a number of other things, you will postpone, if not totally eliminate the possibility of having children. And this is something that they've seen, for instance, in every country in the world, not just in the West, but in places like Taiwan, Korea, even in parts of India, China, etc. So the Chinese were basically trying to curb population. At the same time, global trends and trends in the economy were going to do it anyway. And so they made a bad situation worse. So China doesn't have a replacement rate of growth at the moment in terms of children. In fact, that's one of the things Jack Ma was pointing out, is that there's not enough babies being born in China at the moment. If you take the number of babies being born and multiply it by the average age of a Chinese person, that means the long-term stable rate of the Chinese population is going to be about half of what it is right now. That is a very, very, substantial change in that economy. Anyway, so demographics are going against us. So what does it mean? It means firstly, China is going to stop being the world's, major exporter. Why? Because they're going to have less people that can make stuff and more people that are going to be buying stuff, because the elderly people are going to be around and they're going to be consuming things, but they're not going to be making anything. And the number of people making stuff in that population is going to go down as a percentage, and overall in real terms as well. Because there's going to be a less workforce, because, if two workers had one child, they're going to have one worker replacing them. Doesn't exactly work out. So the demographics are bad. And that leads us to the next problem, which is what? One of the biggest, investment, towards vehicles in China is actually property. For a number of reasons. The Chinese government has not allowed people to invest overseas as easily. The stock market has not been great. Some things have been great, some haven't. But people, believe in, property. There's the pension system in China is now great as well. So if you were, a Chinese individual in the 80s and 90s and say 2000s making your money, what were you doing? You were buying property. Why? Because, you didn't want to put all your money in the stock market. You couldn't get your money out in the Chinese stock market anyway. You couldn't get your money out of the country as easily. You buy a flat, you buy two flats, and then that's your retirement policy. Unfortunately, when everyone's buying a flat, you got to build some of these flats. So the Chinese economy has been built with these big developers out there, building huge, property developments, and at the same time, you're doing a situation where there's oversupply, but it's going to be under demand, because, like I said, there's less people. People are falling. So what's going to be happening? You're going to have basically ghost towns being built, and that's what's happened. So you've had a case where there's been, such massive overinvestment in infrastructure, so in real estate, that there's a bubble there, and that bubble is going to have to burst. Unfortunately, the Chinese government has not taken that into account properly, and like I said, all this person in charge is not going to have probably the wherewithal to basically understand some of the newer things that are happening out there. I'm not saying it's senile, I'm just saying it's like, it requires a bit of energy, a bit of innovation that does not increase when you're over 70 years old. Okay, so the financial markets of China are really vulnerable because of their overdependence on the property sector. And then the final thing I want to discuss with you is the possibility that we have a conflict. Okay, one of the ways that we see people, countries in this particular situation resolve it is a conflict. Why you are to distract people from what's happening, to increase patriotic fervor, to give more power to the government, though the Chinese government does not need it, in order to basically fight against this particular thing. And that has resulted in a bit of a backlash.
from other parts of the world, which might have come anyway. It's just the way of the world. When you have a rising power, generally there is a backlash. Even Japan, which had a very, very good relationship diplomatically, etc., with the US, faced a backlash when its car industry started to overtake Detroit's, the US car industry, and they were faced with a massive pushback. And in fact, they had to agree to things like quotas in terms of how many cars they could send to the US, etc. And what that did, by the way, interestingly enough, was make Japanese cars even better, because if you're limited the number of cars you could sell, what do you sell? You sell better, more expensive cars, and that helped increase the the Japanese reputation for good car making. But in China, what's happening right now is you're seeing them being cut off of the high-end, technological developments out there. So recently, this week, the Biden administration passed a ban on investment in AI in China by US companies. They've already made moves to basically restrict the export of computer chips as well as computer chip making equipment to the Chinese. Chinese have responded, feebly by, restricting the export of rare earths, but that's a very minor thing compared to what the US is able to do. So the overall tensions are rising, and that's also going to hurt the Chinese ability to basically, function in the modern economy. Because if you have a declining workforce, you have this elderly population. One of the ways around it is increased productivity, and they do that by, going up the technological ladder. And the final thing is this. On the worst case scenario, this conflict, this increase in religious hostility results in war, like with Russia. Now, if you had invested money in Russia over the last couple of years, when the war started and you didn't get your money out quickly enough, that money became effectively worth nothing to you. Why? Because we are part of the Western economic system. We are not part of the Eastern economic, or the Russian, Chinese allied economic system. We are not part of that. The Western economic system is controlled by the US. When the US says basically, no, it doesn't go through. To give you an example of how powerful that is, the Russians had to default on their debt, not because they didn't have the money, but because no bank would take that transfer. They couldn't literally transfer the money to the people they owed money to, and by that definition, they had to default on their debt. But they had the money available, and why couldn't they do it? Because of the US power. Another example, one of the ways the Americans and the European allies are controlling the Russian oil industry is just basically by not giving them any insurance on their ships. That's enough. You don't insure their ships. Most countries will not let a huge container of oil go past their coastline, because there's an accident, it could cause untold millions of damage in terms of the fisheries as well as the beaches, etc., etc. Who's going to pay for that? You have no insurance, and so therefore you're going to be having a lot of countries not letting you transport your petroleum without insurance. So that's another factor. And so that means that if we do see a significant conflict that causes the Chinese to take the same route as the Russians, I do suspect that we're going to have a problem with regards to getting money out. And finally, like I mentioned, I just want to talk about a couple of things on AI. Goldman Sachs has come out and said by in the next 10 years or so, they easily foresee $1.5 trillion of investment into AI, in the US alone. That's a huge amount of money. That's over 150 billion on average, or 150 billion on average for the next 10 years per year going through. We've also seen, for instance, Apple come out and talk about the fact that their $22 billion research budget, which is huge, significantly more than companies like Tesla, etc., is primarily focused on AI, or that increase is due to AI. So we are seeing more and more investment going through. There's been a bit of a quietening down in terms of the actual new products coming out, because people are still, got GPT-4, we got, Claude 2 coming out, and that kind of stuff. But there's not been a step change. There's not been something like that between GPT-3 and GPT-4, or GPT-3 and GPT-3.5, that kind of movement happening. But I'm seeing a lot of investment going through. So we are likely to see that investment bear fruit next year. But don't be fearful that you see a little slowdown in terms of crazy new programs or crazy new abilities that AI has. The money is coming in, and for the first time, real money. GPT-4, $100 million to train. What do you think Apple's $22 billion is going to be doing? Thanks for joining me again this week, and I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Cheers.